The Nikon 14-30mm f4 for the mirrorless Z mount is the best landscape photography lens I've ever used. I know that sounds like a really big statement, but in this video I'm going to run through the case for why I feel this lens is so superb and why it's perhaps a little bit underrated. Let me be clear before I proceed any further, I'm a landscape photographer and I use this lens only for landscape photography. So my evaluation of this lens is entirely framed by the specific needs of that photographic niche. My Lightroom portfolio tells me that around 50% of all the images that I've taken are at focal lengths wider than 30mm. So clearly wide angle landscape photography is my favoured sort of area, so I should be well placed, hopefully, to provide some good insights on this lens. So I moved to Nikon's mirrorless Z mount earlier this year with the purchase of a Z7, and believe it or not, the 14-30mm lens was actually one of the main draws that led me to actually make the leap over from the DSLR F mount. So hopefully this video will be particularly useful if you're sitting on the fence about going mirrorless at the moment and you're potentially considering this lens, or for those of you that are just generally interested in why I'm so enthusiastic about it. This isn't going to be one of those YouTube reviews that's packed full of technical graphs, because that's just not my style. Instead, I'm just going to focus on the key points that make this such a superb lens based on my real-world experience. So why is this lens so fantastic? Well, in a word, compromise. Now this is a word that's often seen as a negative, but it really isn't, and I'll come back to this term throughout my review. So let's get started on the key points. Compact and light. This lens clocks in at 485 grams and 8.5 centimeters long. Considering this is an ultra wide full frame zoom lens, those are impressively low measurements. As a point of comparison, the F-mount Nikon 16-35 f4 clocks in at 680 grams and 12.5 centimeters long, whilst the 14-24 from Nikon clocks in at an absolutely back-breaking kilo and 13 centimeters long. That's almost as much as this lens and my Z7 combined. Canon's 15-35 RF is 840 grams, Sony's 16-35 is 680 grams. You get the picture here. This thing is small. Low weight and compactness count for a lot in landscape photography. There is no point owning the sharpest lens in the universe if it practically restricts where you can actually take it. The ability to reach hard to reach locations quickly and without overexertion, in my experience, actually translates into better images over time. With the right gear, you can react to fast changing light like a gazelle and not like an elephant. Its small size is mostly down to its maximum aperture of f4, which is going to be off-putting for some people. But for most landscape photography, it's absolutely zero problem whatsoever. I would say outside of astrophotography situations, 99.99% of my landscape photography does not require an aperture any wider than f4. If you do a mixture of landscape photography and astrophotography, then I think you need to be honest with yourself on what the actual ratio is between them. Say for example, if it's 50-50 between those, then perhaps getting an f2.8 wide angle is actually a wiser sort of direction to take. However, if you're anything like me and the ratio is probably 90-10 and that's being generous, then for me it makes absolutely no sense to lug around the extra weight of the f2.8 glass to only benefit from it occasionally. To me, it makes more logical sense to actually get a separate wide-angle astrophotography geared lens like the Samyang 14mm f2.8, and then just pack that in your bag as and when required. Interestingly, the 14-30 does appear to have very good chroma performance, so while its aperture isn't ideal for astrophotography, it's probably actually capable of rendering really good results if you just push your ISO that little bit higher or use star trackers, for example. All of what I've just said would count for absolutely nothing, however, if it wasn't for the next point. Optically superb. This lens captures absolutely incredible images, it really does, and it's more than up to the task of the 45 megapixel sensor in my Z7. The corner to corner sharpness is absolutely incredible, particularly when stopped down, and I've been absolutely blown away by the images that I've managed to capture using this lens. It manages to strike an absolutely wonderful compromise between its optical performance and its portability in the field. The lens's nano coating deals with sun flares absolutely brilliantly, relegating them to a pretty much non-issue when using this lens, and it also does a really strikingly good job at creating sunstars in images at apertures narrower than f11 and beyond. I've been really taken aback by just how easy it is to render them in my landscape photography. Distortion and vignetting performance is very impressive, with built-in correction profiles working their magic. Also, the lack of VR is an absolute non-issue here because VR's actual use case at wider focal lengths is quite limited, and the Z mount bodies actually have IBIS built in anyways. Nikon are clearly leveraging the wider Z mount to good effect here, because for my money, this lens is miles better than any of the f-mount wide-angle lenses that I've ever used. And if this lens is anything to go by, the 14-24 f2.8 Z, which is coming later this year, is going to be absolutely out of this world. Ultra wide. When I first purchased this lens, I thought that I would rarely use 14mm because it would just be too wide, a little bit too much. How wrong I was. I've found I've been using that wide sort of angle of 14mm, 15mm surprisingly often, and it just gives me beautiful flexibility in my wide angle compositions. The difference between 16mm and 14mm may sound negligible, but it really isn't. For someone like me who likes wide-angle photography, the difference is incredible, and I honestly feel empowered in my wide-angle shooting like never before. It takes filters. In times gone by, going ultra-wide past 16mm would inevitably result in a bulbous front glass element, which would make mounting filters an absolute nightmare. That is not the case here at all. This takes 82mm filters, so I can easily attach my polarizer and ND filters, which makes this fantastic for landscape photography, and I can do so without having to pack some specialist filter holder the size of a bus. One thing I would say is be very careful what filter system you choose to use with this lens. The extreme 14mm focal length is very challenging for a lot of filter systems, creating significant vignetting. My old Lee filter system just could not cope. I'm now using a Nissi V6 filter holder, which does a really good job and creates no vignetting on this lens at all. Good focus breathing performance. This is actually a key element which many people seem to be overlooking. With wide-angle landscape photography, the key to getting effective images is to try and fill your foreground with large dominant elements, and that inevitably means that you need to get up close to them. Now this poses a big challenge for depth of field through a scene, and this is one of the main reasons why I tend to use focus stacking quite regularly in my landscape shooting to mitigate this issue. Focus breathing refers to tiny changes in focal length as the lens changes focusing position. Now, with focus stacking in post-production, this can cause serious issues when you're trying to blend those images together. But that isn't a problem on the 14-30 at all, because there's basically close to zero focus breathing on this lens at all. This makes this a focus stacking beast. Simple with good build quality. For me, the lens feels professional, slick, elegant and well built. And I've seen a lot of critique out there that it feels cheap and plasticky, with a lot of critique directed to its external focus mechanism. But for me, they're totally wrong and they're totally missing the point. The lens strikes the perfect compromise balance between build quality and portability. It doesn't add in unnecessary premium and heavy materials into its build, and it doesn't add in superfluous buttons and features that just aren't needed. It only adds in exactly what it needs to get the job done, and I really respect that. The lens is fully weather sealed, which makes it absolutely perfect for landscape shooting. And you know what? The external extension just doesn't bother me. I do wonder if we've all been conditioned into associating this kind of mechanism with poor, cheap design, but that is just plain out wrong here. This design allows the lens to be smaller and more compact, and I will take that every day of the year over what it looks like. Quick and accurate autofocus. The lens is rapid, silent, smooth, and most importantly for landscape shooting, accurate when it comes to its autofocus. I really have been blown away by the performance of this lens, and I do truly believe that this is perhaps one of the best autofocusing lenses I've ever used. Trust in autofocus is difficult and hard fought for to obtain, but when you find it, it's absolutely invaluable. So that's my rundown of the key features that make the 14-30mm pretty much close to landscape photography perfection. If I was to scrape the barrel and come up with some negatives, well, I don't particularly like the unlock mechanism on a lot of these Z mount zoom lenses. It's just an annoyance, but again, I totally understand why it's in the design because it helps keep it small and compact. I'm not a big fan of the focus by wire system in these lenses either, but again, I totally understand why they use it, and perhaps some would make an argument that the lens is too expensive, but I think they're actually completely and utterly wrong. The price of this lens is completely in line with the F-mount equivalents, and it's likely going to be about half the price of the Z-mount f2.8 wide angle that's coming later this year. And given how utterly superb this lens is, and the fact that I could easily get a decade's use out of this lens quite easily, then I think it's actually a little bit of a bargain. Small, light, sharp, optically superb, ultra wide angle, filter friendly, great focus breathing, well built, weather sealed, with incredible autofocus. Seriously, what more could I ever want in a wide angle full frame lens for landscape photography? It's just pretty much close to perfection, and when paired with a Z7, it makes for an absolutely formidable bit of kit. So that's a wrap for today's very positive review. I don't think I've ever done such a glowing review on anything in my life, but this lens, I genuinely think I'm in love with it. Don't tell my wife that. But if you've got any experiences on using this lens, maybe you own it yourself or you're just intrigued by it, etc., or you've got any questions on it, pop the comments down below. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. And yeah, that's a wrap for today. So thanks very much for watching. I hope this video has been useful for you, and I'll see you all soon. Take care.